As an introduction, ALM Octane SHIFT is a scalable, high-performance automated solution to migrate data from different applications such as ALM QC, Field Central, and Jira, and it also includes X-ray test management entities from Jira. The tool is developed using the ALM Octane Java REST SDK, and it consists of a generic core to which adapters can be added to support a new lifecycle management application. Micro Focus offers various migration services to ALM Octane, and those are end-to-end migration service through professional services, migration service through partners, and there's an assistant migration service through the ALM Octane CFRD team. And you'll have to reach out to go.octane@microfocus.com to get started with the assisted migration. It's good to know that the migration is different from a synchronization, and ALM Octane Shift, it's not a synchronization tool. So it's used to perform a one-time, one-way migration to ALM Octane. And there are several differences between Shift and any other conventional synchronization tool. Shift is purposely built to move data to ALM Octane only. Shift provides a better performance to get the data across into ALM Octane. Users are included in the migration. The project customization is migrated as well, and Shift comes with several migration strategies for users and other entities. X-ray entities are also migrated, and when it comes to ALM QC, UFT tests are included in the migration as well. As prerequisites, you'll have to have ALM Octane version 16.0.100 or higher. ALM QC version should be 12.21 or higher. GRE 1.8.x to latest. And for HTTPSs, the required certificates must be installed before running the tool. ALM Octane API access key with the roles you see here. And the same goes for ALM QC. You can use for both cases, for both endpoints, either API keys if ALM QC supports them if your ALM QC version supports API keys, and the API keys or the user and passwords or the user you want to assign to you want to use for the migration should have the following roles. So for Octane, you'll need space admin, workspace and workspace admin roles. And for ALM QC, project administrator or site administrator. And you'll also need a dedicated machine to run Shift. Now we'll talk a bit about the migration process and flow. Migrating from ALM QC to ALM Octane is not just about moving the data itself. It includes other aspects as well, such as migrating only the relevant projects, defining the best workflows, configuring the tool, testing and validating the migration, and there is some preparation that has to be done before the production data migration should start, so it'll fit your business needs. Micro Focus Customer Success and ALM Octane Customer-Facing R&D team will assist you throughout the migration process, so you'll have a successful transition over to Octane. And this includes helping you select the right projects to migrate and choose a migration strategy, help with workflow and any other manual configuration on your ALM Octane workspace, configuring and running ALM Octane Shift, testing the migration, help with your CI integration, and connecting to the rest of your ecosystem. We have 3 recommended migration strategies. So we have the framework only, active and relevant projects migration, and the full migration. So the framework only entails the migration of a skeleton or just the framework of an ALM QC project over to ALM Octane. Active and relevant projects migration strategy, you should be able to filter out some data or only migrate the relevant data or projects from a certain ALM QC project. So there's no point in migrating data that you will not use. And of course, there's the full migration where you can migrate everything. The overall migration process will look something like this. So you would start by reviewing the projects you wish to migrate. We will work together with you to understand different ways of working. you will have to prepare environments for testing the migration. The migration has to be tested and validated. Then you'll start planning for the production migration and prepare the projects for the actual migration over to production. And the production migration happens for each project. And then we can say we finalize the overall migration process. And now we have a migration flow for each project. So for each project, you'll start by understanding the project configuration, configuring Octane workspace if needed, configuring Shift, running the migration and validating the data, and perform any post-migration changes if needed. And after that, you validate the migration and you finalize a migration flow for each project. Now we're going to talk about the ALM QC to ALM Octane migration. The following entities are migrated from ALM QC over to ALM Octane. We have a more detailed mapping of ALM QC entities to their corresponding entities in ALM Octane that can be found on the following slide. So I'll just jump over to those. ALM QC entities that are not migrated, so user roles and milestones are not included in the migration. Of course, user roles can be mapped to existing roles in ALM Octane. This is the ALM QC to ALM Octane entity mapping, and you can pretty much see what we have in scope for the migration from ALM QC. So users, releases, cycles, defects, manual tests, automated tests, manual run steps, test sets, requirements, history will be migrated over as an attachment in a PDF format. Attachments and comments will be migrated over to ALM Octane. And of course, we didn't forget about the relations between entities. So all relations that exist in ALM QC and ALM Octane supports will be migrated over to ALM Octane. And here, if you want to learn more about ALM Octane, make sure to visit this link. And that's pretty much it. If you want to get started, always feel free to reach out to go.octane@microfocus.com. That's about it for the presentation. And now we'll get started with the actual way of using ALM Octane Shift. ALM Octane Shift comes zipped. Once you unzip it, all the resources will be extracted to your local VM or whatever you plan to use the migration from. This will probably take a second. Perfect. After all the resources are extracted, you're ready to use ALM Octane Shift. Before we start running the tool, we should create a new workspace in ALM Octane in which we plan to migrate our data from ALM QC. And to do that, you'll access your ALM Octane server, go to Spaces, and create a new workspace. After the workspace is created, we will also create an API key so that ALM Octane Shift will use to connect to ALM Octane. And to do that, we access the space level and head over to API access and create a new API access key. This API key has to have the space admin and workspace admin role assigned to the workspace you're planning to do the migration in. We create it and we'll save that information. I'll just paste it in the description of the API key so I have it handy. Okay, and now we're ready to start the ALM Octane Shift. I have my API key and my new workspace ready in ALM Octane. let's head over to our folder where we have unzipped ALM Octane Shift. To run ALM Octane Shift, you can always do it through an UI or with the command line. But we'll start with the UI, and at the end I'll show you how to use the command line version of the tool as well. Let's start the ALM Octane Shift. This is the welcome page of the Shift UI, and we'll go ahead and click Next. The UI server will boot up for a second. And now we'll choose the endpoint we're planning to migrate data from, or the source. In our case, it'll be ALM QC. Now we'll need to provide the source information. I have my ALM server here. I'll just copy the server URL, paste it right here. Then I'll need the username and a password to connect over to ALM QC. You can choose to store your credentials in the configuration file or not to store them. I'll choose storing the credentials in the config file just to show you how it looks like. And once those credentials get stored in the configuration file, they will also get encrypted. Let's connect to our ALM QC server. Next, we'll have to select the domain and the server project we plan to use. In my case, I only have one, so I'll go ahead and click Next. And now we have the ALM Octane connection. We'll do the same thing for ALM Octane. We have to copy the server URL. Make sure you have nothing after the port. And the same goes for ALM QC. So make sure you don't have any slashes or any other stuff. We'll use the API key we've generated. We'll copy the client ID, paste it right here, and the client secret. And we will also choose to store the credentials in the config file. You can always see your password just to make sure you've entered the correct one, and connect to ALM Octane as well. Once connected to ALM Octane, again, you can choose the shared space and the workspace you plan to migrate your data into. In our case, it will be the demo migration, the new workspace we created. Okay, we'll go ahead and click Next. Now we have some required settings that have to be provided. You'll need a default ALM Octane release name, so a default release which will be used where this field is mandatory and the value is absent, like it's stated in the tooltip. I'll just call mine default release. You can always choose an existing release if you already have one created in ALM Octane. Next, we'll need the ALM QC server time zone and the default ALM Octane user. So yeah, we'll need this one as well. Before we actually run the tool, we actually have a few other configurations as well. So to head over to our other configurations, we have to click on the config folder right here, and the configuration folder will open up. Also, in case you haven't noticed, on the bottom left part of the UI, we have a link to the user guide as well. Once you click that, the user guide of ALM Octane Shift will boot up as well. And you have here several functions or sections on how the tool works. Before we actually jump into the configuration, I wanted to talk about the functional scope a little bit, and where you can see a more in-depth view of what data actually gets migrated over to ALM Octane. I'll zoom in a little bit. So these are the entities that are in the migration scope and the corresponding entity in ALM Octane as well. We also have some nodes for each entity, just so make sure to check that out. The relations metrics, and now I also have the field the field migration as well, and how the fields are mapped and what fields actually get migrated over to ALM Octane. All the custom fields from ALM QC will be migrated over to ALM Octane by default. You can disable if you don't want a certain field to be migrated over to ALM Octane, but by default, all of them will be migrated. And next, we have the default field mapping. And here we can see all the system fields from ALM QC mapped to Octane system fields for each entity. So most of these fields make sense to be mapped this way. They can be changed if needed, but this is a pretty similar approach. So we have the summary as name in Octane, the description as description, of course, and so on. And we have this for every entity. So make sure to check this one out as well. For now, let's head back to our configuration files, and we'll also check in parallel when needed the user guide. So the migration tool, ALM Octane SHIFT, comes with two configuration files. So you've got the migration properties, which part of it we've already configured through the UI. I'll just go ahead and open it right up. Okay. So this is how the migration properties looks like. After we actually run the tool, these values will be filled in as well. So default release name, time zone, and yeah, all these values will be filled in. But it's also good to note that we have other ways of configuring the tool as well. And this is the part where the filters are created, or where you can filter out a certain set of entities not to be migrated or to be migrated. So you've got the entities filter that comes this way. So to disable a certain set of entities, you should just change the value from true to false, and in this case the defects will not be migrated. And you can also do some queries. Let me just uncomment this. You also have a small documentation above each parameter or each property above it, and once you uncomment it, you can change it. Also, I'll jump over to the user guide. Under the how to use section and configuring the tool, you have added the migration properties file. Most of the properties already have default values, but once you can also check that out in the user guide and see what those values actually are, and you can change those according to your needs. So make sure to check the user guide and see what are the ways of running ALM Octane SHIFT. So there's a lot of configuration that you can do. And this is the most important part. This is where you do the filters, or you filter out a set of data. You also have a set of examples. Let's use one of the examples. So we can use the migration of defects. Actually, I will not use the example provided, and I will create my own. So I'll just delete this one and add this one. So I will only migrate the defects that have the status open, but I disable the migration of defects. So I'll just turn it on, and I will do a filtered migration, and I will have only the defects with the status open migration migrated over to ALM Octane. You also have a lot of other properties related to users. So if you plan to migrate users as well, and the users don't have a email domain, you should provide a default email domain here. But all of these properties are also documented and are pretty easy to use. Okay, so once we've configured this, I'll just save the file. And now we have an additional configuration file, which is the mapping.json. And this is how the mapping.json file looks like. So it's broken down in several sections. I'll start from the bottom. So at the bottom part, you can do the role mappings. And you can also specify a default role in case the specific role is not mapped for the migrated users. A default user will already be inserted here once you start running the tool because you've done that configuration in the UI. We've got the automated run status mapping, and it looks like this. So on the left side, you've got the ALM QC run statuses, and on the right side, you've got the Octane ones. I'll close this. Next, we have the ALM QC status to Octane phase mapping, and we have it here for defects and manual tests. And again, on the left side, you have the ALM QC, and on the right side, you have the ALM Octane. And to create a new mapping, you should do something like this. So you copy this one. Let's just take as an example. Format it to look the same. I'll call this ALM status and Octane phase. And also a default one is provided. So if you want to map your ALM QC statuses to Octane phases, this is how you're supposed to do it. And if you have to do it multiple times, you can add as many mappings as you want in this JSON mapping file. I'll just remove this for now. Next, we have the list mapping, and we have similar lists in Octane and ALM QC. So you've got the severity and priority list, and here you can map those values. On the left side, you've got the ALM QC values, and on the right side, the ALM Octane values. The same goes for severity and priority as well. And this is the status. This is the manual run status mapped here. So on the left side, again, you've got the ALM QC statuses, and on the right side, you've got the Octane statuses, yes, of manual runs. A quick note here would be that you cannot migrate in ALM Octane or you cannot map a ALM QC status to the planned status in Octane, as Octane doesn't allow the creation of a manual run in the planned state. Okay, and the last part will be the field mapping. Like I said, there's by default a field mapping provided. Automatically all the system fields are mapped, and I show them to you in the user guide under the functional scope. But here you have some example in case you have to do some additional mappings. And you also have inside the user guide under the edit the mapping.json file, you have examples on how to use this mapping. So the field mappings, you can disable the migration of a certain field by using this flag, skip migration, and turning it true. And there should be examples on how to use each flag. So like this one, Boolean skip option, and so on. And the same goes for all other sections of the mapping. So this would be the configuration files. And once you've configured the migration properties and the mapping.json, you are ready to run the tool. And to run the tool, you just click on the run button and the migration will start, in our case, from ALM QC to ALM Octane. I'll just go ahead and run it. Yes, so you will get prompted that the migration process will be started, and make sure you've updated the mapping and migration configurations. And if you're sure, you can start the migration. And I'm sure, and I will click yes, and the migration will start. You can always see live logs here. So once you click here and open the migration.log, you can edit it. And you can see the live migration as well. You also have a progress bar here, and you can see that right now the mapping is being performed. And you can always see the migration flow in the user guide as well, so you can get an idea of how or in which way will the data be migrated over to ALM Octane. Okay. In the first part, the migration will start with the customization. So obviously it started with the mapping, so it validates the mapping, it does the mapping, and then it starts with the customization migration. And in the customization migration, we have the users included, the lists, the releases, the test folders, test set folders, requirement folders, and so on, UDFs. And if the migration has some errors during the customization migration, you will be prompted that, hey, you've got some errors, maybe you should verify them. So you will make sure that the rest of the data will be migrated correctly, since the rest of the data will reference the customization and the users and so on. Now we'll wait for the first part of the migration to finish, and we'll review if we have any errors or if not. If we don't have any errors, the migration will just carry on. But this migration is under my control, and I've inserted some errors just to show you how it looks like when you've got one. The customization migration has finished, and we see that it finished with some problems. The migration got interrupted, so we can fix those problems or accept a list of consequences. And to see that, you'll have to click here, access the logs, and decide to continue or not the migration. I already have it opened here, and we can see a list of all the problems we had. So most of our problems are related to the users, and if we scroll up, we can actually see what happened during the customization migration. So let's get it from the top. So here we have all the information, like what ALM project was used in Octane workspace, what was filtered during this migration, and a list of the entity count, the mapping, the list migration, the users getting migrated over. So a certain users fail to be migrated over since it doesn't have an email address, and it's telling us that we can set a default email domain using this property in the migration properties. Okay. There were some UDFs that already had existing labels in ALM Octane, so ALM Octane doesn't really allow you to create two UDFs for two fields with the same label. And for those, a UDF was added at the end of the label so they can get created. Okay, we also had a warning on yes, my user wasn't allowed to get the parameter from ALM Octane, but that's quite okay, as the tool verifies the parameters as well. Okay, and this is pretty much all the issues we had. So a user didn't have a first name and last name, so yeah, the full name is empty for ALM QC user admin, and username is used as Octane user first name and last name. If you don't accept the consequences, you can head over to ALM QC and modify that user. The same goes for this user, Octane ALM, and this user didn't have a email address also. So I'll stop the migration just to show you how it looks when you fix a configuration problem. But if you're okay with the consequences, you can just click yes. But right now I will click no. The migration tool finished, and we'll run it again and modify the default email domain. To run it again, you just double click on the executable again, run ALM Octane SHIFT, go over the same process, but you already have the data filled in, so it'll be much faster. It'll prompt you if you want to resume the previous migration, and of course we do in our case, or you want to start a new migration. So this is how the resume mode works as well. So if somehow the connection is lost or something happens and the migration stops, you can always resume it by just starting it again, clicking on resume. But if you don't want to resume it, you click on a new migration and you can start a new migration and configure a new one. But we will just resume the previous migration in our case and just modify the property I was talking about. I'll connect again to ALM QC, use the same ALM project, connect to ALM Octane. The right workspace is also used. And over to the required settings. We'll head over to the config folder and migration properties, where we will add a default email domain, which is this parameter right here. I'll just use this default domain as test, or I can name it demo, save it, and go back to my tool and run it again. And now we'll run in the resume mode, and no data or anything like that will be duplicated if it runs in this mode. And again, it's going through the same process, but it'll be much faster this time. It reached the same point. Now the migration got faster here, but we still have problems with the users, with the user that doesn't have a full name. And also it's telling us that the property has been filled in, and this is how the email address will look like. So it'll be Octane ALM at demo. So my property that I just said will be used. It's also telling us that. And yeah, I'm okay with all of that. And I'll just click yes. And the migration will go on and start with the actual entity migration now. As you can see, we'll go through the requirement documents, defects, tests, and so on. I'll just fast forward when the migration ends, and we will review the data together and see what actually happened. The migration has been completed, and it is completed but with issues. And to view those, we can click on the report, and we can actually see what happened, and we can see that some attachments were skipped, one was failed, one and some other warnings that we previously saw. So these warnings are for the customization. We know about the warnings for the workspace users and fields and releases as well. And if you click here, it should redirect you to the attachment source ID that failed. But you can also see a more detailed information of what went wrong in the migration log. You can also see the report here. And if we scroll up, we'll definitely see why. Yeah, so this is the skip. These are the skipped attachments, and these attachments got skipped because the attachment, attachment extension HTM was not whitelisted in Octane. It was not supported by Octane. I'll just jump over to Octane and show you how to modify that, because this one is a pretty common thing. So under the shared space level, you can whitelist attachment extensions. Just go to parameters and go to the end of it and add the parameters that It's not whitelisted, the extension. Save it, refresh it. And now if you run the migration in resume mode again, those attachments will be migrated over again. But before we do that, we can actually have a look on how the data got migrated over to Octane. And to do that, we'll access the workspace we migrated the data into. Once we access the workspace where we migrated the data, we can actually see that we have custom fields migrated over. So these are the custom fields migrated over from ALM QC. And they got migrated over for all other entities as well. So let's take another one. Let's take manual tests, for example. There are some PDFs created for manual tests from ALM QC as well. And also the lists are part of the customization. So we can see the user-defined list that got migrated from ALM QC. And of course the releases. And we can also see these releases in ALM QC as well. So these are the ALM QC releases. Let's take one, for example. So we'll take AOS. And let's see. So this release also has 7 sprints. And we can see that it has the same thing in ALM Octane as well. In the name, you also have the ID from ALM QC, which is 1024. The start date and the end date. And to see the sprints or cycles from ALM QC, you'll have to actually access the release and check the sprints under the timeline. We can also check the users. So this is where all the users were migrated over from ALM QC. All of them were migrated as a viewer because that's the value, that's the default role I assigned for the users. I didn't map any roles, and this is the default one. Okay, and now let's jump into the workspace and review the rest of the data. We'll start with the defects. So to reach the defects in Octane, go to the issues module. And here you will have all the issues or defects. As you can see, all of them are in the phase open, and there's only 30 of them. And in ALM, I have a filter that's running here as well. And you can see that's 30 defects in the open status, but if we remove this filter, there's actually 70 defects. But we did a filtered migration. And you can see that all the information or the related users were migrated over from ALM QC description, and also the history and any attachment that the defect might have. Okay, let's check the quality module. We'll go to the tree view. And we can see the tree view here as well. We can check out the test folders were migrated over to ALM Octane as application modules. And the root folder name, you can change it in the properties file, but by default, it's called test folders and test set folders. And here we can see the manual tests. The manual tests along with the steps and any other details that it might have. You can also check or see what the actual or the original ID from ALM QC of an entity is by checking the source ID. So this field is automatically created for all entities, so you can verify the data from ALM Octane to ALM QC. So this is the manual test with ID 54 from ALM QC. We should see the relations migrated here as well. So we can see that this manual test is linked to 22 requirements, 9 manual runs, 8 test suites. We can also see the runs here, and all of them have different statuses. Let's take this one, for example. Okay, the history is migrated as well for all entities. We can see it for the manual runs as well here. And if we go back to the relations, we can also see that this manual test lives inside or is associated in eight test sets or test suites in Octane. And we can also see all the manual tests inside the test suite, or you can just see it under the test set folders. So if we click on test set folders, we'll see only the test sets from ALM QC. And to see the manual runs, we can also click here, and we'll have to go to the root. And here we can see all the manual runs migrated from ALM QC with the native status. And we also have the requirements left. The requirement folder structure is also migrated. You can see the requirement document details. So all requirements will be migrated over as requirement documents, and the original type will be stored in the UDF, so ALM requirement type. So this one was a document title type, but if we go to a different requirement document, you can see that this was actually a business model. And if you want to see the rest of the fields, you'll have to configure the form or the edit form in ALM Octane. And yeah, there's a lot of fields that you can add. Maybe you have a lot more fields in ALM QC than I do, but that's the form configuration is done post migration. So the requirement folders will be migrated as requirement folders, and the requirements will be migrated over as requirement documents. And you can also see them here. We can add a different field, so we can add the type, so we can see the requirement types as well. Okay, now let's get back to our migration for another second. So we saw the migration finish, but it finished with some problems. We'll click finish. We've already added the extension for the attachments, and we'll run the migration again. But this time I want to access the configuration and actually enable all the defects migration. So now I want to migrate all of them, or what was left, because we previously used the filter. And once we save it, so I hope I saved it. Yep. And now we'll go over to our ALM Octane SHIFT again. Click next. Resume the previous migration, choose the ALM QC endpoint. Connect again to both endpoints. And after we've already configured or removed the filter we had on the defects, and we'll run the full migration now, along with the modifications we did on the Octane side, where we should get the rest of the attachments. I'll click yes. And while the migration runs, I'll also show you where you can run the version of the tool that doesn't use a UI. So if you want to run the tool without using a UI, maybe you want to run it on a Linux VM or something like that, you will have to configure the tool, or I mean, the same configuration can be used. So you can go to the Shift folder, config ALM, and configure both the migration properties and mapping.json, but do it manually. like we previously discussed. And you also have the user guide if you are not sure how to do it. And to run the tool without the UI, you just double click on this run bet, and the migration tool will start in the command line. That's pretty much it. So it's pretty straightforward, and the rest of the process is the same, but you will not see this progress summary here. You will actually just see the command line and the live logs inside the command line, the ones that we can see here as well. Okay, we'll wait for the migration to finish, and then we'll review the unfiltered data migration as well. The resume migration has finished, and we can see that the migration is completed. And now, we can also see the report and see that we have more defects migrated. We have one warning for this defect. And again, to check any warnings or errors that we might get, we can always check them out in the migration log. We'll see it. Let me just search for it real fast. We see that 2 attachments were skipped, and that's why we had in the report, we also had some attachments not migrated or skipped. So I know that in this project, I have 2 attachments that have no content, and they can't even be downloaded. And there's another extension that Octane doesn't support, but again, I show you how to whitelist any extensions that you might need in Octane. But let's also look for the warning we had for defects. Yes, so it was related to this defect that had this attachment skipped. It's saying that the actual defect had the warning because the attachment for that defect was skipped, and it was skipped because the extension was not supported. Okay, and now if we jump back over to ALM Octane and go under issues, we'll do the same in ALM QC as well. We see that we have 70 defects, and it's the same number we have in ALM QC as well. As you can see here. So we have 70 defects in ALM QC, the same in ALM Octane. And now that we've done a full migration, another filter one, you can see that we've also got the defects under fixed, status, opened, rejected, closed, and so on. Okay, you can also see that some releases are associated to the defects. So all the fields that are filled in ALM QC for an entity, they will be filled in ALM Octane as well after the migration. That's about it. As a recap, I'd go over again. I will go over again really fast about what we've talked. So we've started with a presentation of the whole ALM Octane Shift process and how you should work. This is the tool. The configurations are under the Shift and config ALM for ALM QC. You can access the config folder from the UI as well. And you can also run the tool from the CLI using this pet file inside the Shift tool and configure the mapping.json and migration properties manually, completely manually. As you've probably saw, we have to do some manual work as well for when we're using the UI. That's it, and thank you for listening.